I was 51 years old the spring Josephine Ainsley stepped off the noon stage, and I'd have sworn on my own mother's Bible that I knew Caleb Marsh better than any living man. I'd worked the Longwater since before he was tall enough to throw a saddle, watched him bury his daddy at 19 and his brother at 24, watched him turn from a laughing boy into a man who counted feeling the way other men counted coin, carefully, and always coming up short. So when he told me one January night, over the stub of a tallow candle and a column of figures that wouldn't balance, that he'd sent off to a matrimonial agency in Kansas City for a wife, I near swallowed my pipe. "A wife," I said. "A cook," he said, not looking up. "A housekeeper. A woman who'll keep the place and not chatter at me. I'm not a young man, Hollies. I don't need a sweetheart. I need a pair of hands and quiet in the evenings." I remember I laughed and he didn't, and that was the whole shape of Caleb Marsh right there in one exchange. He'd written the plainest, coldest letter a man ever mailed to a woman he hoped to marry. I know because he read it to me to be sure it left no room for false expectation. Wanted, a practical, sober, plain-mannered woman for marriage in the keeping of a working ranch. No romantic notions. No idleness. Apply if you can cook, mend, and hold your tongue. He was proud of it. He said it saved everybody grief up front. I told him it read like a notice for a hired man, only colder. He said a hired man he could fire, and a wife he couldn't, so it paid to be plain going in. There's no arguing with Caleb when he's got a thing worked out to his own satisfaction. I let it lie and figured no woman with sense would answer such a thing, and that would be the end of it, and Caleb would go on alone the way he'd gone on 15 years, and I'd go on frying him bad bacon till one of us died. What he got in return should have warned him. Most such women write back all soft and hopeful, promising to be good and biddable. The letter that came back to the Longwater in February was 2 pages of a fine, fast hand, and it did not promise to hold anybody's tongue. It said, and I had it near memorized before the season was out, for reasons you'll see, that the writer could cook plain or fancy, keep books better than most men keep them, and had run a mercantile single-handed for 6 years. That she found his advertisement bracingly honest and preferred honesty to flattery. That she had no romantic notions to spare either, having watched romance do a woman precious little good. And that she would come on the spring stage if the term suited, on the understanding that she was not applying to be furniture. Caleb read that last line 3 times. I watched him do it. His mouth moved on it like a man tasting something he couldn't name. "She'll do," he said. "She won't pine at me." "Caleb," I said, "a woman who writes like that isn't quiet." "She'll be tired when she gets here," he said. "It's a long way from Kansas City." I have laughed about that sentence for 20 years. He wrote back that same night, 3 lines, terms accepted, come on the April stage, and mailed it in the morning before he could think better of it, which for Caleb was as near to reckless as the man ever came. Then he spent the next 2 months being sorry he'd done it, in his way, which was to say nothing about it at all, and to work harder than usual so as to have an excuse not to think. He mended the corral he'd been meaning to mend for 3 years. He whitewashed the barn. Once I caught him standing in the doorway of the little back room that had been his brother Daniel's, looking at it, and when he saw me, he shut the door and said the room needed airing and never went in again till she came. I understood him better than he'd have liked. A man who spent 15 years making sure there was nothing in his life the world could take, and who's just mailed off an invitation to something he might come to want. That man's going to be short-tempered come spring. The stage came in on a Thursday, in that green, muddy, hopeful part of spring when the range turns the color of a new dollar, and the whole country smells like cut grass and calf. Half of Sweetgrass Bend found some reason to be near the depot that day, because a mail-order bride for the flint-hearted Marsh of the Longwater was the best entertainment the town had booked all year. Old Ferris, who kept the feed store, was there, and the widow Pauley, who kept the county's news better than the county paper, and a clutch of the saloon men come out into the daylight to see, and every one of them wearing that particular look a town, wears when it's expecting to feel superior to somebody. Caleb wore his good coat and his worst expression. I stood by the wagon holding the team and pretending I wasn't there to watch. The door opened, and a woman came down the step without waiting for a hand, and set a small carpetbag down in the mud, and looked around Sweetgrass Bend the way a schoolteacher looks around a room she means to bring to order. She was not plain. I'll say that first, because it mattered less than everybody thought and more than Caleb would admit. She was a tall, brown-haired woman near 30, with a strong straight nose and a mouth that looked ready to argue, and eyes that took in the whole street, the gawkers, the mud, Caleb in his good coat, and weighed it, and came out somewhere near amused. She was not a soft, hopeful, tired little thing come to be grateful. She looked like she'd walked into worse rooms and left them tidier. "Mr. Marsh," she said, picking him out of the crowd without a hint. "You have your mother's chin in the photograph you didn't send. I'm Josephine Ainsley. Which is my trunk?" That's how it started, not with a blush, with "which is my trunk." Caleb's jaw did a thing I'd never seen it do, a kind of hitch like a gate catching on a stone. "Miss Ainsley," he said, the trunk's the big one." "The big one and the crate," she said. "The crate is books. Mind the corner, there's a good deal of weight in the bottom." And she picked up her own carpetbag again before I could reach it and carried it to the wagon herself. The town watched Caleb Marsh's mail-order bride load half her own baggage while he stood there holding his hat, and I swear you could hear Sweetgrass Bend deciding it had gotten its money's worth and then some. The widow Pauley had it all over the county by supper, how the Marsh bride had stepped down bold as a marshal and called Caleb out by his mother's chin and hefted her own trunk, and how Caleb Marsh, who'd stared down outlaws and bankers both, had stood there red as a boy. Folks laughed. They laughed all spring, right up until the summer they stopped, and started saying instead that the Longwater had gotten the best of any bargain struck in that county in 20 years. But that comes later. The ride out to the Longwater is an hour and a half of open country, and Caleb, who could go a whole roundup on 20 words, tried to lay down the law inside the first mile. "I'll be plain," he said, eyes on the team. "This is a working ranch. I keep early hours and I like my supper hot and my evenings quiet. I don't need managing and I don't need conversation. You do the house, I do the range, and we'll get on." "That's very clear," Joe said. "Good. It's also," she went on in the pleasantest voice, "the least sensible arrangement I've heard proposed, and I've heard some. But we'll try it your way first since it's your ranch." Caleb near dropped a line. "My way is the way it'll be." "For now," she said, and looked out at the green country going by. And I, sitting in the back on the crate of books, put my hat over my face so neither of them would see me grinning like a fool. She asked him things on that ride, in the quiet between his laws. Not idle things. She wasn't a woman for idle things. She asked how many head he ran and got a number. She asked about the water and got a shorter answer. She asked was the note at the Sweetgrass Bank or with a private party, and I felt Caleb stiffen up on the seat beside her, because that was business, and business was the one door in himself he kept nailed hardest. "That's my concern," he said. "For now," said Joe again, mild as milk, and let it go, and I should have known then that Josephine Ainsley never truly let anything go. She just set it down where she could pick it up later. "I want to be fair to Caleb, because it would be easy to make him a stone and her the only living thing in this story, and that isn't the truth of it. The truth is that Caleb Marsh had made himself hard the way a man makes a callus over a real wound, to keep from being hurt in the same spot twice. His father died under a rolled wagon when Caleb was 19 and left him a mortgaged ranch and a younger brother to raise. His brother Daniel, a bright, laughing boy, took a fever at 22 and was 3 days dying, and Caleb sat every hour of it. After that Caleb decided, the way grieving young men sometimes decide, that loving people was a debt that always came due, and he'd sooner not borrow. He'd run the Longwater 15 years alone since, close to the bone, close to broke more seasons than not, and he'd got it into his head that a wife was a practical arrangement or nothing at all. Because if he let it be more than practical, he'd have one more thing the world could take. He'd sent for a woman he could hold at arm's length. God, or the matrimonial agency, sent him Josephine Ainsley instead, and it was the best thing that ever happened to that stubborn man, though it took him the better part of a season and a near-ruinous cattle deal to see it. She'd been running from something too, mind. I learned her side slow, in pieces, over that spring. Her father had kept a good mercantile in a Kansas town, and Joe had kept his books and then kept the whole store when his eyes went, and she'd been the reason it stayed solvent through 2 bad years. When he died, she'd assumed the store was half hers by every right of the sweat in it. Her brother, who'd been off being important in Kansas City, came home, produced a will Joe had never seen, and sold the store and the house both, and handed her a share that a careful woman might stretch to a year of boarding house rooms. He told her kindly that she ought to marry, that a woman couldn't keep a business, that she'd be happier not carrying such things. He meant it kindly. That's the part that had put the flint in her. She'd carried the thing beautifully for 6 years, and the world had looked at her carrying it and decided she oughtn't to be allowed to. So when a cold-eyed rancher advertised for a woman to cook and mend and hold her tongue, Josephine Ainsley read it and thought, I got this from her own mouth. Years on, there is a man who at least isn't pretending. And a ranch is a business, and a business can be run. And out there, nobody knows I'm not supposed to be able. 2 people who'd both decided love was a fool's errand, is what came down the road to the Longwater that spring. It's a wonder either of them ever admitted otherwise. But a ranch in calving season doesn't leave much room for a man and a woman to stay strangers, and the Longwater got its work in on both of them before either noticed the fence was down. They married the second day, in the front room of the preacher at Sweetgrass Bend, plain and quick, the way Caleb did everything he was afraid of. Joe wore a good dark dress and no fuss. The preacher's wife stood up for her because there was nobody else, and I stood up for Caleb, and the whole thing was over in the time it takes to shoe a gentle horse. When the preacher said the part about loving and cherishing, I saw Caleb's throat work, and I saw Joe watching him, not soft, just watching, the way you watch a horse you're not sure of yet, not afraid of it, just learning it. She said her I will clear and level. He said his low. And then they were married, 2 strangers who'd each sworn off the very thing they'd just promised, and we drove home in the wagon in a quiet that wasn't hostile, exactly. It was more like 2 people who'd each expected the other to be the enemy and were privately revising. The house was the first battle, and she won it so gently he didn't feel the ground go. Caleb's house was a 2-room cabin gone gray inside from 15 years of a bachelor and a hired man not caring. First morning, Joe stood in the middle of it turning slow, the way she'd turned in the middle of Sweetgrass Bend, taking its measure. Then she rolled her sleeves and went to war on it, and by the time we came in off the calving ground at dusk, the place smelled of lye and bread, and there were curtains, in Caleb Marsh's house, cut down from something she'd carried in that trunk. Caleb looked at the curtains like they might charge him rent. I didn't ask for curtains, he said. No, Joe agreed, setting a plate in front of him that had actual food arranged on it like it mattered. You asked for supper hot and your evenings quiet. The supper's hot. I'll try to be quiet, but I warn you I'm out of practice. And she sat down across from him and ate her own supper with the manners of a woman who dined better than this and expected to again, and did not chatter. She just was so plainly, comfortably present that the quiet Caleb had asked for turned out to be the loudest thing in the room. He ate everything on the plate. I noticed he had seconds. Caleb Marsh hadn't had seconds of anything but coffee in the 15 years I'd fed alongside him on beans and my own poor bacon. It's fine, he said, of the best supper that house had ever held, and got up and went out to the barn to be alone with a horse, which was where that man went to feel things where nobody could see him do it. Joe watched the door shut behind him. Then she looked at me. I was still hanging back at the end of the table, hat in my hands, unsure of my place in this new country, and she said, "He's not unkind. He's frightened. There's a difference, and I've got patience for the second kind." "Ma'am," I said, "I've known him 30 years and I couldn't have told you that." "You knew him 30 years and never had to guess what he was thinking to get a store's accounts to balance," she said. "It sharpens a person. Sit down, Mr. Hollies, and finish your supper. A man your age shouldn't eat standing up." Nobody had called me Mr. Hollies in longer than I could recall. I sat down. I'll confess the plain truth. I was hers from about that moment, and I never once regretted the surrender. She learned the ranch the way she must have learned the mercantile, by walking every foot of it and asking every question and forgetting nothing. Inside a week she knew where the water was and where it wasn't, which pastures were leased and which were held, how many head we ran, and how many we'd lost the hard winter before. She learned the hands' names and their families, and which of them sent money home. She found the tally books inside the first 3 days. Caleb kept them in a box under the bed, of all places, which tells you what he thought of paperwork, and she didn't say a word about them yet. She just knew where they were, setting the thing down where she could pick it up later. And she cooked, God, she cooked. And I'll say plainly that a good cook is not a small thing on a ranch, where a man's been eating his own bad bacon for 15 years. She made bread that made grown hands go quiet. She made a stew out of a tough old hen, and some spring greens that Petey the young hand near wept into. She baked a pie the first Sunday, and Caleb ate 2 pieces and said, "It's fine," and went to the barn, and I began to keep a private count of how many times that man said, "It's fine," and fled, because it was as near as he came to saying a thing had reached him. The second thing she did, she had no business doing, and it changed everything. There'd come a hard luck heifer that week, a first calf mother down in the low pasture, and she'd been straining most of a day with the calf turned wrong. Caleb and I had both had our arms in that poor animal past all decency and couldn't get the leg round. It was full dark, cold spring dark with a wind off the snowfields, and Caleb had that flat, grim look that meant he was fixing to lose them both and hate himself for it. And down the slope from the house comes a lantern, bobbing, and it's Joe in Caleb's own oilcloth coat with her sleeves already rolled. "Go home," Caleb said. "This is no place for you. You've got hands like fence posts and you're tired," she said, kneeling straight down in the muck. "I've got small hands and I'm not. My father kept milk cows and I calved every one for 11 years. Tell me what's turned." Caleb stared at her. The heifer groaned. And whatever was in that man that always chose pride went quiet for once in the face of a life going out, and he told her, low and fast, what was turned, and Josephine Ainsley put her thin, strong arm where 2 grown men's hadn't fit, and talked to that heifer in a voice I'd never heard her use, soft, soft, all the flint gone out of it, and found the leg and brought it round. And that calf came into the world slick, and steaming into her lap, while she laughed out loud in the cold with her hair come down and mud to her shoulder. Caleb knelt there in the wet and looked at his mail-order bride holding his live calf and laughing, and I watched something move across his face that he'd spent 15 years not letting move. He shut it down quick, but I saw it. It was the first crack, and once a thing like Caleb Marsh cracks, the water always finds the way in. "You'll catch your death," was all he said. "Then you'd have to advertise again," she said, "and think what the town would say," and he almost laughed and turned it into a cough and carried the calf up to the barn himself so she wouldn't see his face. That night late, I came out for water and found them on the porch, not talking, just sitting, the lantern between them and the cold spring stars overhead, and Caleb had got her a cup of coffee to warm her, and they were watching the dark where the barn was and the new calf in it, and neither one said a word, and it was the most married thing I'd seen either of them do. I got my water quiet and went back to bed and left them the night. Word of the calving got round to the hands, and that was the third thing, and it wasn't small. There were 4 of us worked the long water that spring counting me, and cowhands are the world's fastest judges of whether a person is worth their salt. A ranch wife who calved a lost heifer in the dark and laughed doing it was a legend by breakfast. When young Petey took a bad kick in the barn and cut his shin to the bone, it was Joe who cleaned it and sewed it with a steady hand and a needle out of her own kit, telling him the whole time about a worse cut she'd sewn on a drunk in her father's store, so that Petey was laughing by the last stitch and forgot to faint. After that, those 4 men would have walked into the snowfields for her. They started tipping their hats. They started washing before supper. They started, one by one, bringing her things. A hand named Das who'd been surly as a bear brought her a mess of trout he'd caught, shy as a boy, and stood turning his hat while she praised them. Sweetgrass Ben's opinion of the Longwater bride went from poor mismatched thing to the best thing that ever came out of Kansas inside a month, and the only man on the place who wouldn't say it out loud was the one who'd married her. But he was thawing. I could read it, and I'll wager she could read it better. He started coming in for dinner at noon, which he'd never done, saying it saved a ride. He started telling her things about the range at supper, not chatter. He'd never chatter, but a sentence then too about the water in the north pasture or the price of beef, and she'd take that sentence and turn it over and hand it back with something in it he hadn't seen, and he'd sit there chewing on the something. I remember one supper in particular, because it was the first time I saw the shape of what was coming. Caleb was worrying at the price of beef out loud, which for him was a flood of talk, near 5 whole sentences, about how a man couldn't make the numbers come right no matter how he ranched, how his father'd made the same land pay and he couldn't, how maybe he just hadn't the head for it. Or, Joe said, buttering her bread, the numbers are coming right for somebody, just not for you. Caleb looked up. A ranch this size, this water, this many head, she said, does not lose money 3 years running if it's ranched well, and Mr. Hollies tells me you ranch it well. So either the country's against you, which it isn't since your neighbors are managing, or the money's going somewhere between your gate and your bank, and you haven't looked hard enough at where. She said it plain and kind, the way you'd point out a man's cinch was loose. It's usually the price you sell at. It's almost always the price you sell at. Who buys your beef, Caleb? And Caleb Marsh, who did not like his business read at his own table, got that flint look and said, Sledge buys my beef. Vernon Sledge. And he's the only man in the county who'd carry me through the bad years. So I'll thank you not to, and he stopped, because Joe had gone very still, the way she'd gone still over the heifer, and her eyes had gone somewhere far off, doing arithmetic. He carries you, she repeated. How does a man carry you exactly? Does he lend you money? It's not your. Caleb, she set down her knife. I ran a store 6 years. I have watched a dozen men be carried by a friend, and I have watched every one of them lose the store. A man who lends you money and also buys what you sell has both his hands in your pocket, and you'll never feel the second one for being grateful about the first. I am not saying your Mr. Sledge is a thief. I am saying that a woman who kept books for 6 years would very much like to look at yours, and if they're honest, I'll never mention it again, and I'll go back to my curtains. There was a long, dangerous silence. And then Caleb Marsh did a thing that told me more about how far that woman had already gotten into him than any of the tender moments. He didn't storm off to the barn. He sat there. He was quiet a long minute. Then he said, "Lo, after supper," and I knew the fence was down for good, whatever any of them said about curtains. I have to tell you now about Vernon Sledge, because he's the shadow this whole story is stood against, and if I make him just a mustache to twirl, I'll have failed the truth of him, which is that he was worse than that, he was pleasant. Sledge was a cattle buyer and a moneylender who worked the whole tier of ranches east of Sweetgrass Bend, and he had a way about him. Big, warm, hearty, always a cigar and a joke, always ready to carry a struggling outfit through a bad winter on a friendly loan and buy its beef come summer at a friendly price. He gave to the church. He stood rounds at the saloon. He'd pull a bogged wagon out of the mud with his own hands and his own team and wave off the thanks. Half the ranchers in the county owed him, and every one of them thought Vernon Sledge was their friend, right up until the year the friendly loan came due, and the friendly price for their cattle turned out to be a good deal less than friendly, and Sledge, all regret, took the difference in land. He'd swallowed 2 outfits whole that way in the time I'm telling of, the Kessler place and Old Man Hune's, and both times he'd been so sorrowful about it, so reluctant, standing there in his good coat saying how it grieved him to foreclose on a friend, that the county half felt sorry for Vernon Sledge for having to do it. That was his true gift. He could rob a man and be pitied for the trouble it cost him. And he'd got his eye on the Longwater, because the Longwater had the best water in the county, and Caleb Marsh was proud and tired and behind on a note. Caleb didn't see it. That's the thing I have to make you understand about a good, hard, honest man. He'd been raised to think a handshake was a handshake, and he could not credit that a man who slapped his back and lent him money in a hard month was setting a trap. He owed Sledge on a note that spring, and Sledge had offered, all generous, to roll it into a bigger loan and take the whole Longwater beef herd in the fall at a set price that would clear everything. And Caleb was of a mind to sign it, because it looked to him like a friend throwing a drowning man a rope. That night after supper, he took the papers out and laid them on the table, and Joe brought the lamp close and the tally box up from under the bed, and she went to work, and I sat in the corner mending a bridle I didn't need to mend so as to be near it. She read the contract first, quick, her finger going down the columns, and I watched her face change. And I knew before she said a word that Vernon Sledge was a dead man walking as far as this ranch was concerned. Then she went into the old tally books, 3 years of them, and she was at it half the night. And Caleb, who'd have gone to bed to prove he wasn't worried, sat up across from her the whole time. And about midnight he got up without a word and made her a cup of coffee and set it by her hand. And she looked up at him with her eyes tired and her hair down. And something passed between those 2 hard people in the lamplight that I had no business witnessing and will remember till I die. "He's robbing you," she said. "Not lately, for 3 years." She laid it out for him plain, the way she'd laid out that supper. She had it on paper by then in her own fast hand, 2 columns, his and hers. The friendly price Sledge paid for Longwater beef was, near as she could reconstruct it, a full third under what the same beef fetched at the railhead in Cheyenne. She knew the railhead prices. She'd read them in the newspapers Caleb used to start fires and never thought to look at. The friendly loan carried interest folded into the buying price, so it never showed as interest. So a proud man would think he was getting help when he was being bled. 3 years of it she showed him. A third skimmed off every head every fall, quiet, dressed up as neighborliness. And it came to a sum that made Caleb Marsh go gray, because it was near exactly the sum of the note that was strangling him. Sledge had been taking, every single year, just about what Caleb owed him, keeping the wound open on purpose. A man doesn't slaughter the cow he means to keep milking, not till he's ready. "And this," she said, and put her finger on the new contract, the generous one, the rope. "This is him ready." She read the clause aloud. The new paper set the fall price so low and the rolled-up loan so high that when fall came Caleb would owe more than the whole herd was worth at Sledge's price, and Sledge would, all regret, all grief, take the water rights and the low pasture to make up the difference. It was the same knife he'd put in Kessler and Hune. Caleb had been 3 seasons into the wound and calling it a rope, and now he'd been about to sign the paper that finished it. Caleb Marsh sat there in the lamplight and went white, and then he went a dangerous kind of still, and I braced for him to do something proud and stupid, which was his lifelong habit under a hard blow. "I'll ride in and have it out with him," he said, reaching for his gun belt on the peg, and there it was. "You will not," Joe said, not even loud. "You'll ride in and shout, and he'll be all wounded innocents in front of the whole town, and there's no proof a court would hang a dog on, just a woman's arithmetic. You'll make yourself the crazy man who accused a pillar of the county, and he'll foreclose you inside the year with everyone's sympathy on his side. That is exactly what he'd want you to do." She set her hand flat on the tally book. "We don't fight him with a gun, Caleb. We fight him with the railhead." "The railhead's 4 days' drive," Caleb said slowly. "Then we drive 4 days," said Josephine Ainsley, "and sell your beef ourselves to a man who pays what it's worth, and we clear the note out of the honest price with money left over, and Vernon Sledge gets to stand in Sweetgrass Bend and watch it happen and not do one thing about it. That's how you beat a man like that. You don't shoot him. You don't need him anymore out loud where the whole county can see." And Caleb Marsh looked at his mail-order bride like a man who's just watched the sun come up in a direction he didn't know it could. "You'd have made a hell of a rancher," he said. "I'm making a fair start," she said, "if I could get a certain man to quit sending me back to my curtains." I have never in my life seen Caleb Marsh at a loss for a chore to hide behind. He was at one then. He just sat there and looked at her, and for once he didn't get up and go to the barn. Now, I'll not pretend the rest was easy, because a plan is a fine thing at midnight and a hard thing at daybreak. And driving a whole herd 4 days to a railhead you've never sold at, short-handed with the calving barely done, is the kind of thing that founders good outfits. We had 4 hands and me and Caleb, which is thin for a real drive, and it meant Joe on the cook wagon was not a courtesy. It was a necessity, and Caleb didn't like it and said so twice and got told twice, gently, that she was coming and gave it up. But first Sledge came to us, because a man like Sledge always knows. Word got round Sweetgrass Bend, and word always got round. The widow Polly saw to that Marsh of the Longwater was fixing to trail his own beef clear to Cheyenne instead of selling friendly local. And inside 3 days Vernon Sledge came out to the ranch himself, cigar and all, to be a friend about it. He came on a good horse in his good coat, and he sat on Caleb's porch like he owned it, which in a manner of speaking he was hoping soon to. And he was smooth as creek stone. He didn't threaten, he never threatened, that wasn't his way. He worried. Out loud, all neighborly, he worried about the dangers of the trail, the river crossings this time of year with the snowmelt up, the spring storms that could scatter a herd to the 4 winds, the chance the price mightn't hold by the time a man got clear to Cheyenne, the outlaws that worked the Cheyenne road, the way a fellow could drive his whole outfit right to the edge of ruin chasing a few dollars more and come home with nothing. He allowed as how he'd purely hate to see a friend take such a risk. He allowed as how his standing offer was still good, warm and safe, right here at home, no 4-day gamble, a sure thing for a struggling man with a family to think of now. And all the while his little eyes were going over the place, over the barn Caleb had whitewashed, over the curtains in the window, pricing the water. "I hear congratulations are in order," he said to Caleb, and turned that big warm smile on Joe who'd come out with the coffee. "The new Mrs. Marsh. A pleasure, ma'am, a real pleasure. Caleb, you sly dog, you kept her quiet." "How do you do, Mr. Sledge?" said Joe, and poured him a cup with her own 2 hands, and was so pleasant and so plain-mannered, and so plainly just the little wife come out to serve the men their coffee, that I saw Sledge dismiss her in about a second and a half, which was exactly what she'd built her whole manner to make him do. She stayed and poured and listened while Sledge worked on Caleb, and she asked him shy, admiring, wide-eyed, such interested questions about the cattle business, about how a man got started buying, about how he judged a price, that Vernon Sledge, who dearly loved to hear Vernon Sledge talk, settled back in his chair and expanded and forgot entirely to be careful, and told the little wife pouring his coffee exactly what he was paying for beef that season. His friendly local price. Said the number right out, proud of his own generosity, never dreaming the woman refilling his cup had the Cheyenne railhead figure by heart, and was watching his own words dig his own hole. "That's so generous of you, Mr. Sledge," she said, warm as anything. And to think they were saying at the depot the Cheyenne buyers were up to near half again that this year. Imagine, half again. But of course, a body can't trust depot talk, can they? Sledge's cigar stopped, just a beat, halfway to his mouth. And in that beat, I watched Vernon Sledge understand three things all at once. That the mismatched Kansas bride Caleb Marsh had ordered out of a catalog to keep his house quiet was a good deal sharper than any man he'd ever cheated. That she knew the railhead price to the penny. And that she just told him she knew, sweet as pie, in front of a witness, with a coffee pot in her hand, and dared him to do anything about it. The warmth came back into his face, but there was a wire under it now, pulled tight. "Poe talk's a dangerous thing, ma'am," he said, and his eyes on her weren't dismissing her anymore. "Fella can hear all sorts, prices that high, why a man be a fool not to drive up there and get 'em if he got there, if the weather held, if the river was kind, if nothing spooked his herd some dark night on the flats, lot of ifs on a 4-day trail. A sure thing at home's worth 2 maybes in Cheyenne, that's always been my thinking." He smiled all around. "But you folks think on it, think good and hard. My offer's not going anywhere, neither's your water." And he let that last hang just a hair too long, and then laughed like it had been a joke, and heaved himself up and shook Caleb's hand and rode off. Caleb watched him go with a face like weather coming. "He as good as said he'll set men on the herd," he said quiet, "on the flats, some dark night." "Did," said Joe. "That's why we watch the flats on the dark nights." She was looking after Sledge too, and there wasn't a scrap of fear in her, only that far-off arithmetic look. "He made a mistake just now, Caleb, and he knows it. He talked to me like I was furniture, and he told furniture his price. Men like Vernon Sledge only ever make that one mistake, but they make it every time because it's built into how they see the world. We're going to beat him with the mistake he can't help making." She turned and went in to start more bread for the drive, and Caleb stood on his porch and watched his wife go, and then he looked at me. "Hollies," he said, "I have been a fool for 3 years." "You have," I agreed, "because a man deserves the truth from an old friend." "And she came in April." "She did." He was quiet. A man could get to feeling the whole 15 years alone was just waiting for the stage to come in. It was the nearest to poetry I ever heard out of Caleb Marsh, and he looked embarrassed to death the second it left him, and went to see to the horses. But I've never forgotten it, and I don't believe he had it wrong. We put together the drive over the next week, patched the cook wagon, shod what needed shoeing, gathered the herd off the spring range, and Joe laid in provisions with a storekeeper's eye that had us better fed on that trail than the Longwater had been fed in years. She packed her father's shotgun in the book crate, and I saw her check it and knew the wrong end from the right, just like she'd said. The night before we pulled out, she sat up by the lamp and made a thing she called a manifest, every head we were driving, counted and marked, and the weights she could figure, and a fair reckoning of what each ought to bring at the honest Cheyenne price. 3 copies in her fast hand. "So there's no arguing at the other end about what left here," she said. "A man can't lowball you on a count if you walk in already knowing your own count better than he does." Caleb watched her write it out and didn't say, "It's fine," and flee. He sat and watched, and once he reached over and moved the lamp a little so it wouldn't gutter on her page, and she said, "Thank you," without looking up, easy, like they'd been moving lamps for each other for 20 years. The drive itself I could tell you the whole of, and it would be its own long tale, 4 days over green swelling country, the herd strung out a mile in the dust and the bawling, the ache of the saddle and the short cold nights. I'll give you the shape of it and the 2 things that mattered. The first day was the worst for temper, and the best for nothing going wrong. Cattle fresh off good spring grass don't want to leave it, and we fought the herd every mile of getting them lined out and moving. And Caleb was short and I was tired, and the young hands were green at trail work. But we made our miles, and that night, cold and grumbling around the fire, Joe fed us a supper off that cook wagon that turned the whole camp's mood like the sun coming out, hot biscuits, and a stew with real meat in it and coffee that would float a horseshoe. And the surly hand Das said, to the fire, not to anybody. Boss got the best of that bargain. And nobody argued, least of all the boss, who was looking at his wife across the fire with an expression he thought the dark hid. The second day we crossed the first river, the little one, and lost no more than a hat, and Joe drove that cook wagon across a snowmelt ford that would have given a teamster pause, standing up on the box with the lines wrapped and her jaw set. And Caleb rode alongside her the whole crossing, not saying a word, but there, right there, close enough to grab her out of the water if it came to it. And it didn't. On the far bank he said, "You handle a team," which from Caleb was a sonnet, and she said, "My father freighted before he kept store," and that was a piece of her I hadn't known, and I saw Caleb file it away the way she filed things away, to pick up later. They were learning each other on that trail the way you learn country you mean to live in, slow and for keeps. The third night was the storm. It came down on us black and sudden on the flats before the last big river, the kind of spring storm with lightning walking on the ground and thunder that sits on a herd's nerves like a hand. We'd been watching the flats, like Joe said, because the flats on a dark night were where Sledge's trouble would come if it came. But it was God's trouble came first, and worse than any Sledge could have hired. The lightning got into the cattle and they went to milling, tight and moaning, and then a bolt came down close enough to raise the hair on your arms and they broke. The whole herd, all at once, off into the black in the rain, 1,000 head running blind, and every hand horsed and riding for his life to get around them and turn them before they scattered to the four winds or piled up in a wash and died. It's ugly, dangerous work, a night stampede, the worst work there is, and a man can die at it easy under a horse that steps in a hole, under the herd if he goes down in front of it. We rode. Lord, we rode, in the rain and the dark with the ground shaking, the lightning showing it all in white flashes, and then the black slamming down again, working around the flank of that terror to bend it, to turn it into itself and get it milling and stop it. And in the middle of it, in one of those white flashes, I saw Caleb's horse go down in a wash, saw it clear, the horse's legs folding, Caleb pitching over its head into the dark. And then the black came down and I couldn't find him, and the herd was coming. And I heard Josephine Ainsley's voice cut through that whole storm. Not screaming, calling. Hard and clear and unafraid, his name once, twice again. And she was off the cook wagon and down in the mud with a lantern before I could get my own horse turned, running toward where he'd gone down, toward the herd with that little light. And I heard him answer her, weak from the dark, and I saw the lantern stop and drop and her go to her knees in the mud beside him. And I got there finally, my horse near mad with fear, and flung down beside them, and Joe was already going over Caleb with those quick, sure hands, the way she'd gone over Petey's shin, ribs, legs, the back of his skull, fast and certain in the rain, and she found him whole. Stunned. Wind knocked clean out. A gash on his head and a wrist gone wrong. But whole. The herd was coming, and Das and the young hands turned it, God bless them, turned it just wide of us in the dark, close enough that the mud we knelt in shook, and it went thundering past into the storm and began, at last, out in the black, to mill and slow and stop. And Josephine Ainsley knelt over her husband in the driving rain with the herd going by close enough to touch, and I heard her say, low, so low I near shouldn't have caught it, "Don't you do that to me, Caleb Marsh, don't you dare. I didn't come all this way to bury you on the flats." Caleb, flat on his back in the mud with the storm on him and the blood on his face, reached up with his good hand and got a fistful of that oilcloth coat and held on, and said, "I heard this too. God forgive me for the eavesdropping, but I'd earned it by then, 30 years of it. I thought I'd got past minding whether I lived. Told myself I had years back. Found out just now I was lying, came to me on the way down." He got a breath. I mind a great deal, on account of you." That was Caleb Marsh's love letter. That was the whole of it, delivered flat on his back in the mud with a cracked head. And from the way she pulled him up out of that mud and against her and held him there in the rain, not caring who saw, it was letter enough. It was letter and answer both. We lost not one head to that stampede. Not one, which is a thing so rare on a night drive that the young hands talked about it for years after like it was a marvel worked on purpose. And maybe it was, maybe there's a providence looks out for an honest outfit driving to beat a thief. We gathered them at dawn, wet and sorry and whole, and Caleb rode the last day with his wrist splinted by Joe's own hands and a rag round his head, pale but upright. And he would not ride in the wagon though she told him to, because he was Caleb Marsh, and some things don't cure. But he rode close by the wagon all that last day. Closer than the work needed. And they talked, low, the two of them, mile on mile. I couldn't hear it and wouldn't have listened if I could, that once. And it wasn't the talk of a housekeeper and her employer. It was the talk of two people who'd found out in a storm that they'd each become, without meaning to, the thing the other one couldn't stand to lose. We came into Cheyenne railhead on the 5th morning, the herd footsore but whole, having lost fewer to the whole hard drive than we'd any right to hope. And there was Vernon's sledge. He'd rid the coach, the sly dog, no 4-day trail for him, and got there ahead of us. And he'd been at the railhead buyers already, greasing and warning, all friendly concern, telling them that Marsh of the Longwater was a distressed outfit driving trouble beef, footsore and storm-scattered and half-dead, that the man was desperate and behind on his notes and couldn't be choosy, dropping the offers in that stockyard before Caleb ever set boot to it. It was a clever last knife, and it near worked because it played on the one true thing. We were a tired outfit at the end of a hard drive, and a tired outfit will take a low price sooner than trail home unsold, and Sledge knew it, and meant for Caleb to arrive, find the price beaten down by rumor, and come crawling back to the friendly local deal after all, with the whole ruinous cost of the drive lost on top of it. He'd have foreclosed by Christmas. He was that close. But Joe had the manifest. She'd kept it every mile, updated it every night by the fire, every head, every weight, the losses near none, the condition. 3 fair copies in her fast hand. And while Caleb stood in the stockyard buyer's office jaw tight, that splinted wrist and that rag round his head making him look exactly like the beaten desperate man Sledge had painted, watching a smug buyer named Prentice lowball him on Sledge's whispers, Josephine Ainsley set that manifest open on the man's desk, turned it round to face him, and went to work. I don't have the head to give it back to you the way she gave it, but she laid the Longwater herd out on that desk like a lawyer laying out a case. The count, her count, exact, taken and retaken on the trail, better than his tallyman could do it in the pens. The weights. The grade of the beef, which was good beef, prime spring beef off the best grass and water in the county, whatever Sledge had whispered. And against it, the current Cheyenne quotes, she had them cold, from the newspapers Caleb used to burn, from the depot talk that turned out to be no idle talk at all, quoted to the day. She set the buyer's own low offer down beside the honest market number and let him look at the gap. She never raised her voice. She never once accused Sledge of anything, never had to. She just made it impossible, in front of the man's own clerks, for him to go on pretending the low offer was anything but a favor to somebody in the corner who wasn't the seller. And no honest buyer and Prentice was honest enough, just lazy and led, wants that said plain in his own yard, with his clerks listening. "You've been told this is trouble beef," she said, pleasant, final. "You can see it isn't. You've been told we're desperate. You can see our count is better than yours and our weights are better than you hoped, and we know the Cheyenne price to the penny. Now, you can buy prime beef at the honest number and be glad of the bargain, Mr. Prentice, or you can pass, and I'll walk this manifest 4 doors down to the buyer who'll be glad I did, and he'll wonder all season why you sent him prime spring beef for free. Which would you like?" The offer came up. It came up and up. It came up to the honest Cheyenne price and then a hair over, because by the end of it Prentice wanted that herd and wanted more, to be seen dealing square with the sharp-eyed woman who'd caught him out in front of his own men. Caleb Marsh sold his beef that morning for near half again what Vernon Sledge had spent 3 years training him to expect, enough to clear the note entire, pay off Sledge to the last dishonest cent, and drive home to the Longwater with money in the wagon for the first spring in living memory. And Sledge, this is the part I have savored for 20 years, Sledge had to stand there in that stockyard and watch it happen. He couldn't make a scene. A scene would have been a confession. In front of the buyers, he still had to work that whole tier of country. He had to stand there, big and warm and sick to his soul, and shake Caleb's hand when it was done, and say he was real glad it worked out for him, real glad, and take Caleb's money, his own honest money, at last, that cleared the note and cut Vernon's Sledge loose from the Longwater forever. "Safe trip home, Mr. Sledge," Joe told him, sweet as the coffee she'd poured him. "Do mind the river crossings. A fellow could take such a risk." And Sledge looked at her, and for just a second the pleasant fell all the way off his face, and I saw what was under it, and it wasn't pretty, and then he put the pleasant back on because it was all he had, and tipped his hat to her and left. He knew he'd been beaten. Worse than beaten. He'd been beaten by furniture, by the little wife with the coffee pot, and he knew that too, and it would gnaw him the rest of his days. We rode home slower than we'd come, an easy 4 days, the wagon light of beef and heavy of coin, and Caleb Marsh was a changed man on that ride, though he'd have died before saying so straight out. He rode next to the cook wagon most of it, when the trail let him, that splinted wrist crooked on the reins, and I'd hear the two of them going at some subject or other. The price of land east of the bend, whether to buy the Kessler outfit's water now that Sledge wasn't going to, and it'd come cheap, how many hands they'd take on with money in hand, could a ranch run good books and would she keep them, ought they run more cattle or better cattle. And it wasn't chatter, and it wasn't the arm's-length quiet he'd advertised for. It was two people building something out loud together, each one making the others thinking sharper. It was a partnership. It was, though the stubborn fool wouldn't yet have used the word for it, a marriage, the real kind, the working kind, the kind his mother and father must have had on that same land before it all went hard. He found the word the last night, on the Longwater's own range at last, with the ranch a dark shape ahead against the last of the light, and the spring stars coming out thick. I'd bedded down a little off, the way I always did to give them room, and I heard them at the low fire, and I'll give you the end of it because it's the whole point, and because I'm an old man now and there's nobody left it could embarrass. "I owe you an apology," Caleb said, "a long one, for the letter, for the curtains, for telling you to go back to them, for sending off for a woman I could keep at arm's length, and then being angry at you every day for the crime of not staying there." "You don't owe me an apology," Joe said. "You owe me a partnership, written plain at the courthouse. My name on the ranch same as yours because it's my arithmetic that kept it and we both know it, and I'll not spend my life being grateful to be allowed to run a thing I saved. I did that once already for a father who deserved it and a brother who didn't, and I'm done being furniture, Caleb, even beloved furniture. I told you that the first day in the mud with the town watching." "You did," he said, and then in the dark, in the plainest voice that hard man had, "I'll put your name on it Monday. I'd have put it on today if the courthouse were open. But that's the business, and the business is the easy part, and I find I've got a harder thing to say, and I'd best say it before I lose the nerve, because a man who's been thrown off a horse in a storm oughtn't to trust his nerve to last." He stopped. I heard the fire pop. "I didn't send for you, not the real you. I sent off for a quiet I thought I wanted, a plain safe nothing that couldn't hurt me. And you got off that stage bold as a marshal and asked which was your trunk, and you were the loudest, brightest, most alarming thing I ever laid eyes on, and you have not given me one single quiet evening since, and I find," and here his voice caught, the gate catching on the stone one last time, "I find I don't want the quiet. God help me, I don't want it any more. I want the loud. I want the arguing and the arithmetic and the curtains and a woman down in the mud in a storm calling my name like she'd fight the whole herd for me. I want you, Josephine, not the wife I ordered, the one who came. And if you'll stay for that, not for the ranch and not for the bargain, but for that, I'll spend what's left of me being glad you answered a fool's cold advertisement." There was a quiet then, the good kind, the kind that isn't empty. "Caleb Marsh," she said, and her voice wasn't level anymore. That is the first romantic notion you have had since I met you, and you did warn me you hadn't any to spare. I'm going to hold you to every last word of it, all the days of your life." "Hold me to all of it," he said. "I'm counting on you too." And the fire popped, and I turned over on my hard ground and put my hat down over my face and grinned up at the dark like the sentimental old fool I'd let her make of me. And I left those two the rest of the night, and I slept better on that cold trail than I'd slept under a roof in 20 years, because a thing had come right in the world that I'd feared never would. That was more than 20 years ago now. Her name went on the ranch that Monday, at the courthouse in Sweetgrass Bend, right next to his, in the clerk's own book, and the county talked about that too. A wife's name on a man's land, whoever heard, and Joe never once cared what the county said, having long since taken the county's measure and found it wanting. The Longwater's the best-run outfit in the whole tier now, and if you ask any man in the county how it clawed its way up out of the hole it was in, he'll tell you Caleb Marsh worked like a mule, which is true, he did. And if you ask Caleb himself, he'll set down his coffee and tell you plain, in front of God and the hands and anybody who'll stand still, that he'd have signed the whole thing away to Vernon Sledge with a grateful handshake and a smile if he hadn't gone and married a woman too stubborn to be furniture and too sharp to be robbed. He says it like a man saying the finest thing he knows how to say. He is not wrong to. Vernon Sledge left the county inside 3 years. Once folks got to comparing notes, and Joe saw to it, quiet that they did, ledger by ledger, farmwife by farmwife, teaching half the struggling outfits in the tier to keep a real count and trail their own beef to the honest railhead and cut the friendly buyer loose the same way we had. Once that got going, Vernon Sledge's whole warm empire came apart like a wet rope. Nobody would sell to him. Nobody would borrow from him. The two places he'd swallowed, Kessler's and Hune's, he had to sell off cheap, and the Longwater bought Kessler's water at the bottom of the price, so that the very land Sledge had stolen ended up watering Caleb's cattle. Last I heard the man had gone off to be somebody's trouble up in the Dakotas, and I hoped they had a Josephine of their own waiting. I'm old now, older than Caleb was that spring by a good stretch, and I don't sit a horse the way I did, and my hands shake at the small work. But I take my supper at the Marsh table most nights, an old hand they never had the heart nor the meanness to pension off to a lonely room somewhere. There's a good chair kept for me by their fire. There are children, I'll not go on about them, except to say the oldest girl keeps books like her mother and argues like her mother, and has her father wound clean around her small finger, and that Caleb Marsh, who once counted feeling the way a starving man counts crumbs and always came up short, is the richest man I know, and knows it, and gives thanks for it out loud at his own table like a man who remembers exactly what the other kind of life felt like. I think on it sometimes, the whole strange lucky shape of it, how a hard, frightened man sent off for a wife he could hold at arm's length, meaning to make sure there was nothing left in his life the world could hurt him by taking, and how the mail came back with the one thing that would make wanting worth the risk again. He asked for quiet. He got Josephine, and she stepped off that spring stage into the sweetgrass mud and looked the whole hard country over and set her bag down and asked which was her trunk, and never once, in all the 20 years since, agreed to be 1 inch less than the whole of what she was. They warned him, back at the start. Half of Sweetgrass Bend warned him, on that muddy Thursday at the depot, that the bride who'd answered his advertisement had a will of her own and would never keep quiet and would run him ragged and make his life a trial. They were right about every single word of it. And by Roundup, she'd saved the ranch he'd all but signed away. And by the next spring, she'd saved the man too, which was the harder job of the two by a long way, and the one nobody else on God's earth would ever have taken the trouble to do. I'd have told you, that January by the guttering candle, that I knew Caleb Marsh better than any living man. I was wrong, and I'm glad I was wrong, and it's about the gladdest a man ever was to be proved a fool. There was one who came to know him better than I ever did. She came in on the noon stage in her own good time, with a trunk of books and a mind of her own and no notion of being grateful. And she saw straight through the hard man to the frightened boy inside him before she'd been an hour on the place. And she stayed anyway. Not for the ranch and not for the curtains and not even for the bargain. For him. For the frightened boy and the hard man both, having decided in her clear-eyed way that they were worth the keeping. A man could do a lot worse in this life than to be seen like that, all the way down and loved for what's seen. Caleb Marsh knows it better than any of us. He'll tell you so himself if you sit at his table long enough of an evening, and he'll pass you the bread while he does it, and his wife will catch his eye across the lamplight, and the both of them will look for just a second like two people who still can't quite believe their luck, and neither can I.